Hi, I'm Max Keiser. I'm here with Melanie from Roxxon TV. Melanie, what's it like meeting me, Max Keiser?
It's been an amazing experience so far in only a few minutes.
Can you really comprehend? I'm going to turn the mic over to you now because after all, this is your show.
Thank you. So you're a presidential advisor. What are you doing? What are you doing down there? What exactly do you do?
We advise the president on Bitcoin policy. So we created the Bitcoin office. And the Bitcoin office, we do two primary functions. One is to guide the government toward having an impactful Bitcoin policy, including a Bitcoin reserve. The country now has 6,000 Bitcoin in reserve. We buy Bitcoin every single day. We have the Bitcoin office. We have the Digital Asset Commission, which is a strategy we use to help keep the country of El Salvador a Bitcoin maximalist, and that is by treating everything that's not Bitcoin as a security. So if you show up with something that's not Bitcoin, we send you to the equivalent of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We say you have to register as a security. So we don't really want to play around with anything. We just want to focus on Bitcoin. And that has paid off very well for us. The benefits of being Bitcoin only, you see it in kind of the security model where the country is now the safest in the hemisphere, soon to be the safest country in the world. You know, Bitcoin is intolerant of violence in a lot of ways. I think there's a connection there, peace and Bitcoin. And we didn't go through Luna, Celsius, all the FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, none of that stuff hit us because we were very strict kind of moat, you know, to keep all the centralized garbage out, and so that's what we do.
It's awesome. I lost quite a bit in Celsius when it went under.
You're the second person I met who's a Celsius victim, and it's a rite of passage, really. I've been in the Bitcoin since 2010. It was 25 cents, and during the past 14 years, every cycle has some high-profile scams. People get caught up in it. They lose money, and I don't know really of anybody who hasn't had that experience except for maybe Michael Saylor. Michael Saylor seems to be like come from out of the loins of Godzilla and stalking the planet and buying all the Bitcoin. You know, he's a very unique individual, and he's never had any shitcoining going on, and so God bless him.
So the strategy that you use, is it the same that Michael Saylor uses? Is it just accumulation?
Well, Melanie, I would say our strategy is not the same as Michael Saylor. It's a strategy of accumulation, but Michael Saylor is using his Bitcoin as collateral to float securities, whether it's his own stock or these convertible preferreds, which are basically debt, to accumulate more Bitcoin. So he's taking on enormous amounts of leverage, which normally would be dilutive for any company to issue shares like that. But in this case, it's magically accretive. It actually adds to the bottom line, and he's developed a metric called Bitcoin yield. So he's up something like 50 or 60% year to date on his Bitcoin yield, which is the amount of Bitcoin he is adding to the balance sheet. Can El Salvador do something similar to that? They conceivably could, but when you're dealing with a sovereign, it's a different kettle of fish. You know, it's a different environment than a corporation. We're very happy that we're able to accumulate Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is legal tender, and it has a huge impact. I'll tell you this, we are always looking at ways to increase our Bitcoin stack in various ways, but the hurdles to get to something like a Michael Saylor strategy, it's a bit more obstacles involved, again, because it is a sovereign versus a corporation.
So because the government of El Salvador is so pro-crypto, what has changed in the population of the country because of that?
Well, the adoption rate of Bitcoin in El Salvador is 100%, and I'll tell you why. Because it's owned by the government in the strategic reserve, every El Salvadoran citizen has the equivalent of $500 of Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin per capita, and so that message gets out there. Like we're actually becoming a wealthy nation, and we're set to become even wealthier. So clearly, nobody else in the Central American region is having that experience. And it's also the fact that Bitcoin is unconfiscatable. And you have a country that has for 40 years been in a civil war and a gang war where extortion was common everyday reality, where people making even $10 a day selling pupusas, they would have $2 or $3 or more paid to the gangs every single day. Now suddenly when Bukele went out and he arrested all the gang members, that's a $6 billion peace dividend on top of a $28 billion at that time economy. That's a 20% boost in revenues right there that hits the bottom line. The president is kind of emphatically focused on cost savings and government efficiency, and he's in it for a legacy, really, and he is really dedicated to making the government smaller, passing along any increases in revenue to the people. And he has a 91% popularity rating, which is the highest in the world. And those are organic numbers. Those are real numbers. If you come to El Salvador, you will feel it. People who are critical of the country and critical of President Bukele, they've not been to El Salvador. They don't know it. It's like Bitcoin critics. When you talk to them, it's obvious they don't know anything about it. They haven't done the work. Anyone, again, referring to Michael Saylor, as he would say, anyone who's done the work on Bitcoin becomes a Bitcoin advocate. No one who's ever done the work has ever done the work and then come out the other side and say, oh, I don't think this is going to work, or I don't think this is any good. That's never, ever happened.
So people that I speak to who don't know anything about crypto, they will say that it's used for money laundering and that it's used by gangs. North Korea uses it. The Russian government used it. But in El Salvador, it's helped to lower the crime rate. Is that right?
Very observant, Melanie. You get the Journalist of the Year award, which would be when you get a special prize for that. I forget what they call it. I'll think of it in a minute. But exactly, Bitcoin is actually not good for criminals. The illicit use of Bitcoin in crime figures show that it's gone from a peak of 3% down to under 1.5%, because it's all transparent on the blockchain. It's like the worst way to launder money in the world is using Bitcoin. The number one way to launder money is through cash, dollars, $100 bills. So that's very obvious. But more to your point, the mentality of Bitcoin is where, what drives people to crime? They live in a society that's run by fiat money barons, and we know at the top, looting is going on in rampant ways. In the United States, there's an insider trading scandal. These politicians are engaging in a lot of activity that when I was working on Wall Street back in the 1980s, they would go to jail for. It's criminal insider trading, market manipulation. So that when looting becomes a way of life, it trickles down throughout your society. When Bitcoin is the base layer, the opposite effect is people are like, I don't need the agina of being a criminal. I can just do my work and I can save, and it's unconfiscatable for me. I know it's not going to be inflated away, and I know no one can take it. So it's a lot, to live a criminal life is difficult to be a criminal. And people would, by nature, rather not be a criminal. But you know what I'm saying? So to your point, yeah, it has done exactly what a Pulitzer Prize. That's what you're going to win as a result of that question, Melanie from Canada. She's a Maple Leafs fan, so let's cry a little tear for poor Melanie, because she hasn't had a winning Stanley Cup team in over 50 years. They're the losingest sports franchise in North America. They have a cool jersey. I had one once when I was a kid, but then I became an adult and I realized these fuckers are never going to win a Stanley Cup. So I followed the New York Rangers, of course, or Boston Bruins, a team that actually can win Stanley Cups. But you know who's worse than the Maple Leafs are the Canadians, the Montreal Canadiens. They're the worst. They should be thrown out of Canada.
Well, talking about opinions on Canada, what are your opinions on what's going on in our country and with our current government?
All over the world is a similar problem, that you have a rise in more reliance on the state, let's put it that way, where going back back to the 1980s, you had a massive wave of deregulation. It was called the Reagan-Thatcher years. And you had the financialization. And you had activist Federal Reserve banks who, instead of trying to gauge when the economy was frothy and that they would raise rates, they always lowered rates for 40 years. They kept lowering rates and printing money. So that encourages malinvestment. It makes people, for lack of a better word, it makes people kind of lazy because they know that no matter what bad enterprise they get involved with, they'll get a bailout, they'll get a stimulus check. So you have your quality of your average entrepreneur goes down, and the ideology of getting money for nothing, quote unquote, from the government is an ideology called socialism, right? And this ideology is one that never has ever worked for obvious reasons. You never see it in nature. It doesn't work in the political sphere of civilization. And for those who want to say, well, what about Northern Europe? What about Sweden, Denmark, Finland? They're not socialists. They are heavy state-run economies for sure. But I think in Sweden, right, they were socialists, and they totally abandoned socialism in the 70s because the country was going completely bankrupt. So there is no example you can point to. In Canada, similarly, they really got addicted to this mentality of socialism, and for politicians, it's an easy way to get elected. The so-called free healthcare in Canada, or the healthcare system in Canada, is similar to what's happening in the United Kingdom, that has happened in the United Kingdom. It's actually, the healthcare system is actually not very good. And so you end up paying a price. And so it's reached the end of a cycle. I don't think it's going to. I think Pierre Polivar, if I'm saying that correctly, obviously represents a change toward a more accountability, let's call it. I don't even want to call it market-driven. I'll just say more accountability. And he's actually talking to the Canadians who do stuff. They drive trucks. They drive the Zamboni. I mean, without Zamboni drivers, where would Canada be? They'd be skating in slush up to their thigh, like, everyone would play as badly as the Maple Leafs. It would be a whole league of horribleness because of this ignoring the Zamboni driver. So that's what's happening in Canada. But you see it in the whole Commonwealth, Australia, Canada, the UK, all these Commonwealth countries. They're all what's that? France and Africa, where they have the several countries there. They're still in the African franc. That's the French franc, and all of these countries are now figuring out that they've got it's a huge scam. The nation state itself is, if I may go on a tangent here, I say money existed before the state. Bitcoin separates money from state. Bitcoin kills the state. And what I mean by that is that the whole nation-state model is crumbling along with the central bank model. In El Salvador, what I'm trying to talk about is pushing the wealth of the nation to the node holders, the community. Everyone has a node, a Bitcoin node in every house, in every home, so that the government continues to shrink because and the wealth goes to the perimeter of society. And so the government, therefore, then becomes a servant of the people because they have the wealth. So if they can say, well, we've got to build, some new roads. Okay, well, go to the node holders of the government and say, we're going to do, let's say, a Michael Saylor. We're going to do a structured borrowing against your Bitcoin. Yes or you talk to the people with the money if it benefits them. The incentive model of Bitcoin, which is, let's for the sake of argument say it's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, if that is scales to society and the governance model of your community, because you're not going to get rid of a governance model. You're not going to get rid of government, and that's not really a goal to get rid of government. I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I think that's as impractical as socialism in its own way. There's always a need, since humans went from relatively small tribes to larger groups.
Yeah.
There's a need for governance. It's not a big need, but there is a need for it. And so therefore Bitcoin governance model, which is the strictest governance model in the world, let's not forget that. There's nothing more governed than Bitcoin, the protocol of Bitcoin. That's what makes it so, it's absolutely scarce. I mean, that is part of the governance model right there. I mean, nowhere else in the world do you find a commodity where no matter how high the demand is, the supply never increases. Okay, that's the governance model. That's a law that's in the protocol. That's a law, so therefore, that's what I think we're going to see. We're going to see that model extend out more into society and in Canada. So I think that the Trudeau era is coming to an end. How many more humiliating compromises can Trudeau make? I mean, now he's completely pals with Trump. I mean, 3 weeks ago he's just so ineffective, but he's not alone. This entire generation of leaders that have decided to buy votes, it's all coming to an end now. And it's no coincidence that Trump and the Bitcoin in the U.S. have kind of come up at the same time. So it's a hopeful scenario, and I'm usually very negative on anything political at all, but I do see how now there could be some, and El Salvador is leading the way in this regard. I would say it's the country that is a role model. They're coming out of horrible times. Bitcoin is a base layer for the economy and the government. So the real question is, Melanie, if I may once again hijack your interview, the question is not where do I see Canada going? The question is, how far will Canada go in imitating what's happening in El Salvador? That's the question. How far will Canada go? I mean, the Canadian people are based. They're based. They live with a bunch of elk and moose, right? They don't see another person for hundreds and hundreds of miles. If you look at a map of the population, 99.9% of the country is just ferrets, beavers, woodchucks, forest, right? And then there's people in Montreal who think they live in Paris. They don't even know how to find Canada on a map. They think they're in Provence. Oui, je suis Canadien. Est-ce que vous voulez un poisson? Quoi? C'est quoi? Québécois? Oh, oula! I am not in Surrey anymore. You see, they're all confused. So you get all these things straightened out and monetize the maple syrup supply. Do a collateralized maple syrup obligation bond to buy more Bitcoin. Take all the maple syrup in Canada,
Tokenize it.
Use the proceeds to buy Bitcoin.
So lastly, one more question. Is it kind of ironic that now all these Bitcoin enthusiasts want the government involved in Bitcoin when it was kind of made as something that the government can't control, or what?
Yeah, well, Bitcoin is for everyone. It's for Russia. It's for criminals. It's for good people. Because you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. It has the ability to change the way people think. And everyone comes to Bitcoin who they are. So, I was mostly come out of the world of finance, and I saw Bitcoin in those terms. Now, there are a lot of people in governments all over the world, and all they know is governments, all they know is politics. They're coming to Bitcoin, and they come to it as a politician, but they are going to be changed by Bitcoin. Look at Cynthia Lummis. She's a Wyoming senator in the United States. She started talking about Bitcoin 3 years ago, okay? Now, Melanie, how incredible is this? She goes on TV and says the United States should sell all of its gold to buy Bitcoin. Now, is that a politician speaking, or is that a disciple of Satoshi? Right? She's no longer a politician. She's now a disciple of Satoshi, who has a day job signing some bills in Wyoming that she probably never even reads. But she works for Bitcoin now. She's a drone of Bitcoin.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
It's rocks on.